Hi, my name is Andrew Banson. Welcome to this Getting Started video series for Stringer Survey for BricsCAD. Before I get started, I just wanted to show you this directory here. It gets installed on your computer when you install Stringer Survey, and what it contains is some training data, and I'll actually be referencing this training data in this video series. So if you wanted to also follow along on your computer, this is where you can access the data. Now I'm going to start off with a completely blank file, drawing file. However, I'm going to create that file with this template, this Stringer Survey template. You can see here it's already set up my new drawing with this template. So this template contains a whole bunch of layers and point styles that Stringer will reference. I also have this JPEG file with a world file which stores the coordinates. I'm going to import that into the drawing as well. I have some raw data. This is an SDR file, and we're going to take that raw data, bring it into a command called connect, and we're going to reduce it to coordinates. Now I also have this CSV file here called control points, and if I just double click and open that up in Excel, what we have here are a list of all the control points and some coordinates, and these coordinates represent MGA coordinates, and I'm going to use these coordinates to shift my or transform my survey onto this coordinate system. So the number here relates to a control point number in my raw data. We also have another SDR file. I'm not going to use this in this tutorial file, and don't worry about the Stringer SiteWorks DWG. But for now, the important file is the drawing template. So I'm going to go and create a new drawing in BricsCAD using that template, and I'm going to run save as and save this file. So I'm going to call it, we'll just call it footy oval for now, and then hit save. So when you've installed Stringer for BricsCAD, this tab will appear called Survey, and this lists all the Stringer Survey commands, everything from settings, importing data, whether from a raw data file or importing a point file. You can of course create points manually or using a number of other different methods. Points are managed using point groups. There's editing tools. There's a transform tool used for helmet transformation. In the middle, we have our string creation tools, string editing, and then cadastral tools is a very useful tool for creating points using bearing and distance. Once we have a surface, we can go into the surface manager, change the style, toggle on and off contours and triangles, that type of thing. We do have a very useful conformance reporting tool in Stringer as well, if you want to compare points against a surface or against an alignment. Model view is used for visualization of your survey data in a rendered 3D environment. We'll certainly make use of this. When you bring in your raw data, it's very useful to open it up in a 3D view and just see if there's any spikes or any issues with the survey. Some labeling tools as well that we can have a look at, adding extra spot elevations, slope labels, that type of thing. And then group table is another useful tool for outputting a legend table for all our points and strings. So you actually have a choice. With Stringer, you can run commands from the ribbon tab here. Alternatively, you can run commands from the Toolspace. So if we go and click on this Toolspace button here, Stringer Topo's Toolspace will display. Now the great thing about the Toolspace is points that we create, or point groups that we create, surfaces that we create, alignment, strings, they all get listed here, so you have a nice overview of the objects that you've created. The other thing that I like is if I go Control 0 to clear screen, I can get a bit more real estate and still run commands from the Toolspace, and I can do that by right-clicking. So as we right-click on an object or a heading, we can we can access a lot of useful commands. However, I'm going to put my ribbon back on. I am a fan of the Toolspace, so most of the commands I run will be from the Toolspace. It also means that I can go to the Home tab or go to a different tab and still access, some useful commands. So if you're completely new to Stringer, which I assume that you probably are, the first thing you want to review are the software settings. Now, if I right-click on the drawing file here, we have access to all the key settings in the software. So there's drawing settings, some settings related to the tool space, settings related to the data that's stored inside the DWG. If I click on string defaults, it's the default styles that I want to use, or set if I am using an alpha numeric data set, default styles if I'm using it just a numeric data set. And you can see here we have a code set, a default point style, and a string set. So I'll show you what each of those mean in a sec, but this is where you can set up your defaults. So if you've created some styles for your company standards or whatever, this is where you would assign those. Template editor, this is really for if you wanted to have a string that had a template attached to it. So maybe you picked up this point, but you wanted to also string a few other points as well that represent some curve or something like that. So we do have this template editor, and it's useful to as I said, maybe you're picking up that point and you want Stringer to also include that point, and that point in the surface as break lines. So that's why we've included a template editor. Maybe something you don't want to do, it's not essential. So then we have the point code set. I'm gonna jump over that and head to point styles first. Now, when I run point styles for the first time, it's just saying to me that, hey, there's layers that the CodeGo points reference that don't currently exist in this drawing. So the software is just going to create them for me. That's cool. It's just going to add a few extra layers into this drawing. So CodeGo points in Stringer Survey leverage the BricsCAD block. So it's very easy to create a block in BricsCAD. If that block has attributes, then we can feed in some properties onto those attributes for display. And that's pretty much how this system works. So when you install the software, we do have a whole bunch of different styles. So if we just have a look at tree TO1, for example, it's going to be placed on this layer called vegetation. Viewport scale and viewport rotate means that if we were to create a viewport on Paperspace, this object would automatically scale for us. Okay, so we have a whole bunch of points. They reference a block, and that block can be an external DWG file, and that's handy because if all my blocks are stored externally, then when I create a new file that maybe doesn't include those blocks, the software is going to import that block into my drawing. However, you can reference a block that exists in your drawing as well, so you've got the option. But how it's set up is we have a folder here that contains a whole bunch of blocks. Those blocks have attributes in them, and the software will ensure that they get added to our drawing. A important part of CodeGo points in Stringer is the idea of a property list. So this is a default property list for the tree. So the properties store things like the point number, the X or easting, Y northing, the elevation code, but then also a whole bunch of other properties as well that you may or may not want to use. Now for a tree, you might actually add some custom properties like, the type of tree or whatever. So this interface allows you to add custom properties to a point just outside the standard ones. And for display purposes, you can set up how many decimal points you want, a certain value to be displayed for. For example, our elevation will always be displayed to 3 decimal places on our point. And you can do all sorts of crazy things like set up a property that might be showing the elevation difference. In fact, this elevation property will subtract from whatever's in elevation 2. So you could have a property that's essentially showing cut and fill information. But anyway, I won't go too deep on this, but point properties are important, and every time you create a point, a property list will be assigned to it, and this is the default property list that gets assigned, in my case, to any tree. So then if you're setting up a point style, the next important thing is to match block attributes. So the software is reading this block from this drawing file. It's read the attributes, and what we're saying here is the point number property, which was in the point property list, is going to be sent to the point number attribute. The code from the property list is going to this attribute, and the elevation is going to this attribute. I don't know why it's set to scale, but the elevation will be assigned onto that attribute. It's probably a little mistake there. But it's really simple. That's how it works. You have point properties that are stored on the point, and then when you create a point, you just match the property up to the attribute, and that is it. And the beauty of this system is that you can come up with any style you want. You just have to create a create a block, and with some attributes, and then in here you just link the properties up to the block. Really as simple as that. That's the point styles. Then we have point formats. Now, point formats actually serve 2 purposes. Firstly, they're used to read in a point file. So if I had a point file that was a PENZD, delimited, this format here describes how to read that point file and how to extract the properties from the columns in order to create the points. So that's what most of these formats at the front or at the top of the list relate to. But then we get to description formatting. And this is for reading the code or the description of a point when we read it from, perhaps a raw data file. So you've been out on site and maybe you picked up a tree and you put the code in as TR, and then you put a space in that was the scale, so TR space 2. So in this case, the format is used to extract properties from the code. And in this case, description code scale, we're splitting up the description by space. We're actually saying here with the checkbox that this is used for extracting properties from a description. And we're saying the first property is the code and the second property is the scale. So you can make up your own formats, not only for bringing in a point file, but also for reading the description of a point. Now, we have a few set up here. I think our default one is this one, description code 1, code 2. However, we support up to 4 codes. So in other words, one point could represent 4 different codes. An example of where you might want a dual code or have multiple codes is, say, where you have a gate, where that point might represent the end of a fence, but also the start of a gate. But this is why we use the default one, so we can have up to 4 codes that Stringer can support when stringing. So that's formats, point file import and extracting properties from points description, raw description. So if we go back to the settings, now I'm going to jump to point code set. So on the left hand side I have a number of code sets, but I'm going to just jump to alpha individual layers to start off with. Now actually currently these tables that I'm looking at are local to the drawing. So there is like a global public database, and we copy these tables and we make them local to the project. So the cool thing is any edits that I make in here are only local to the project. If I make an edit in here, then I can go set as global. So if I was to create my own code set for my company, I would want to make sure I click on set as global so then I can use it for future projects. So if I have a look here, we have the code, and let's have a look at a code that we might string, you know, maybe, let's have a bit of a look. Scroll up. Okay, maybe curve back. So we're saying if we find a code with BCK asterisk, so a wildcard entry, meaning that any character after that don't bother looking at. So the first three characters are BCK. Then we're going to create a point. This is the layer that it's going to go on. This is the point style it's going to use. So as per that point styles library we saw earlier. And this is how we're going to format the description. So using the formats that we saw earlier. So if that's the code, then override layer means rather than using the default layer, that's the layer it's going to use, that's the point style, and that's the description. So really simple, and we just have that for a whole bunch of different alpha codes, and we have that set up for a whole bunch of numeric codes as well. Now, if the software can't find the code in the list, then that's when it heads down to the default. That's the layer we'll put on, that's the default point style and the default formatting for the code. So that's pretty straightforward. That's code sets. If I right click, go back to settings, this time I'm going to have a look at survey string settings. Looks very similar to the code sets. I have an alpha and a numeric code set in here. So this time round, this is all about stringing. So if I have a particular code, in this case BCK, which I showed for the point style, BCK will add a break line to the surface. So once it's strung, it's also going to output some 2D line work, so a 2D polyline. That's the layer it's going to be placed on. We're also going to create some 3D polyline, a 3D polyline. That's the layer it's going to go onto. And then if we wanted to, we could pick a template. So remember I was showing you earlier the template editor. If we applied a template here, then we'd also get those extra codes from the template. That's what that refers to. And if I click on the list, they're all my available templates. So very simple setup for strings as well. Pick the code, and then whether we want to add as a break line to the surface. Do we want a 2D polyline, a 3D polyline? Now, interestingly, though 3D polyline is ticked on here, globally we've said don't do it. So we're going to be outputting 2D line work, but not 3D line work. But at any stage, if I come in here and tick on 3D line work and apply and close, then our 3D line work will appear. So at any point you could come in and do that. Now, very quickly, if you were doing a whole bunch of group editing, we can select multiple entries in here. And if I click on override selected, you get this form appear. So if you wanted to select multiple and turn on and off, you know, things like add break line or whatever, or select a whole bunch and override the layers, this will speed up that, that process for you. Okay. And just like the point code sets, anything we do in here is local to the drawing, but if I set up a really nice table that I want to use for future projects, then I click on set as global. So let me just close out of that. The next setting I want to show you is survey string parameters. So we have a parameter symbol set as dot, and then we have these parameter codes. So if I was creating a string, and at the end of that code I put .f, then we're going to get a 3-point arc created along that string. If I go .a, then I get a 2-point arc. If I want to go back to line segments, then I put .l. If I don't want that point being included to build a surface, then I put .x. So there's a few different parameters in here. So this allows you to override what those parameter codes are, and even the parameter symbol. If you don't want to use a dot, you want to use the hash symbol or something, you can do that. On the right hand side here is template assignment. So I showed you how you can assign a default template based on a code. You can also put a dot parameter, and that's the parameter to on a particular string add some curve or whatever. So you might have the same code being used on multiple strings, but there's one particular string you just want to add, perhaps a curve shape to. So rather than getting all codes with a template, this allows you to just go to a specific code and using a dot parameter place a template. So that's what the point parameters are, also survey string parameters. So just to finish off on the settings, replace code settings is quite useful. We have a command called replace codes, and the beauty of this is if you had a data set that was alphanumeric and you wanted to convert that to alpha coding, this is where you can set up that conversion. So for a whole bunch of numeric codes, I have an alpha equivalent. So later on I'll show you how you can convert an alpha code set or a data set to a numeric data set. Group table styles, I'll have a look at this when we go and output a legend table, but this is where you can go in and set up how your legend table looks, so you can go in and customize that. Our legend table by default is 3 columns, code, the line style, and then the point description. So that covers most of the settings that you really need to know. And as I said, if you're setting this up for the first time for your company, setting up a point code set, important, point styles are important, formatting how the code, the properties get extracted from the descriptions, and then you have the survey string settings as well. The replace codes may or may not be important to you, but certainly when we get to outputting a legend table, you can customize what that is. Another command that's worth pointing out in here is image from satellite. So if you're working on a survey and you just want to bring in the aerial imagery, image from satellite allows you to do that. You just pick the coordinate system and then search for the address, and then the software will bring the image in for you in CAD.